let me start with brain sciences, take us then into military history. Let me do these two steps.
Right.
Starting with brain science, in 1981, since 1981, there's been a dominant understanding of how the brain works, and this is the two sides of the brain. It's because someone named Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for his work on the two sides of the brain, and you've probably heard this. Your listeners have probably heard this.
And we talked about it in an earlier podcast with Dan Pink, Whole New Mind, an interesting book on creativity, actually.
And the typical model is that the left side of the brain is analytical and rational and logical, and the right side of the brain is creative and intuitive and imaginative. And this caught on. People would say, "Well, I'm a right."
And you're good at one and not the other.
You're good at one and not the other. And more recently, people have said, "Well, you have to be good at both, so you have to turn on both sides of the brain, to do both." Well, all of that in modern science is completely overturned. Creativity does not reside on one side of the brain, and analysis does not reside on another side of the brain. The modern science of the brain, analysis and intuition, work in all modes of thought throughout the brain at all times. And the new model of the brain is something called intelligent memory, where basically what happens is as you go through life, from the time you're born, you're essentially putting things on the shelves of your brain. And your brain breaks them down and puts them on the right shelves. And this is literally analysis. Analysis means breakdown. They call it parsing, the neuroscientists. And as new things come in, your brain, when it's working well, searches. It takes each new piece and sees if anything connects to it on the shelves. And when it does, those pieces come together and you have a thought. And if those pieces come from very distant parts, distant shelves, seemingly unrelated shelves, and lots of them come together about something important, you have a very big thought, otherwise known as a flash of insight or a creative idea. Now, what this says is that creativity is actually based on elements that you have to put in your mind and combine. So creativity, and this is true in strategy as well, is a new combination of previous elements.
Well, I really like that. I want to stop there for a sec. So first I want to contrast it with the way I think we sometimes think of creativity and the way I think those brainstorming sessions are what they're relying on, which is that if I just think hard enough,
right,
if I just work at it enough, right, it'll all come together. I'll have that flash of insight. What you're suggesting from neuroscience, which I, both as a occasional thinker and often a parent, find interesting, is that, one, having lots of stuff already in there is a really important part of it. And two, it's about connections of disparate, and it potentially disparate, but
right,
now it turns out similar items that go together.
Right. And in a sense, sort of the ultimate thing, you're absolutely right that somehow brainstorming says look deeper and deeper in your own mind, whereas the answer comes from outside. Right? It's pieces that come into your mind that you then combine. Certainly the combination happens in your mind, but you have to put lots of different things on the shelves of your mind. So look outside, not inside in the first instance.
Well, let me defend brainstorming for a second, something which I happen to think is usually an enormous waste of time. But let me defend it briefly.
Uh-huh.
It's imaginable that you have something on your shelf that's not on mine, and when we're all in the same room, lots of stuff can get thrown together that allows me to network essentially across other brains, right? That would be the best case scenario. It sounds good.
Well, I mean, okay, but why do you need a meeting at 3:30 on Wednesday afternoon for that? What are you doing the rest of the week?
Well, I need to interact with folks. I need to draw on their knowledge that I don't have.
And why do you only do that in a brainstorming meeting?
Yeah, no, that I see. No,
okay,
the idea
so that's one. Two, you're giving the wrong instructions on brainstorming. The correct instructions on brainstorming is free your mind, come up with something completely new. Think outside the box.
Right.
Whereas what you're saying is a very different kind of meeting. You're saying, look, here's something we're working on. Search in everything you've experienced or known or learned, and tell me, do you see any connection here that might be helpful?
Well,
these are two different things.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, the other thing is that that still is not, you still cannot force 3:30 Wednesday afternoon that particular person, that particular idea is going to create in you any kind of flash of insight. Let me start way at the beginning and say, when do you typically have your best ideas?
In the shower.
In the shower.
As you say in the book.
Right, there you go. In the shower, in the bar, everybody always answers this.
Driving in traffic when I'm not thinking about it.
So just practically, in everybody's experience, it's quite obvious that ideas come together in your mind when your mind is relaxed, often about a topic that you weren't really thinking about.
Well, there's two ideas there, and I want to keep them separate for the listeners, because I found this very interesting. One of the insights from neuroscience that you talk about, which is utterly fascinating, and I think everybody has some flavor and taste of, is that, to take a trivial example, when I can't think of the name of some actor in a movie I'm trying to remember, I'm 53. It's taken me a while to realize that rather than just thinking about it and going through the alphabet, trying to figure out what the name is, say I don't have access to Google, the best thing to do is just to stop thinking about it for a while and think about it in 10 minutes or half an hour or tomorrow.
Right.
And talk about what neuroscience has found about what happens when we sleep, which I found extremely interesting. That's one thing, this idea of leaving things alone. And then I want to come back to the interactions. Talk about that first.
So the best way for your mind to make connections is for you to have no preconceptions about what it is it's looking for, where to look for it, which shelves, the name of the shelves. You have to just literally clear your mind. And this is very, very hard to do. Now, there's a discipline of how to do it that comes from Asian martial arts. But the best way to do it is to go to sleep. And this is why people also say that I have my best ideas falling asleep or waking up. Because what happens is that's when your mind is connecting the dots and you can remember what it connected. Now, that's just the way it is. And that's why brainstorming, again, not to beat a dead horse, but that's why saying on 3:30 we're all going to get together and we're all going to have creative ideas about topic X. Well, you're going to have a creative idea on topic X some other time, most likely when you're falling asleep. And also you may have, the idea may be on topic Y, which is what people really should be working on. Right? Very often your best ideas are really off-center. They're not about the thing you thought you should be brainstorming about. You realize, the real problem is something else.
Well, so one of the lessons here, and this is slightly dangerous, I think, as business advice. One of the lessons is, since you can't rely on 3:30 and you're not quite sure what you are going to be thinking about at the particular time that's most productive, what you should do is just hang out with the people in your office, talk about football, the weather, the last novel you read, recite some poetry, and then maybe there's going to be this flash of insight. Is this an argument for going on retreats where you really don't try to figure out what the goal of the business is? You just do ropes exercises?
I think that going on retreats is unrealistic, because then basically we'd have to spend all week on a retreat every week. And then you say, well, what do I do back in the office, right? Well, the answer is I think it's much simpler than this, is that think of something called reverse brainstorming, where you as the boss say to everybody, look, I understand that you're actually going to have your best ideas not at work. That's perfectly fine. At work we're going to do the perspiration of making things happen, and frankly there just isn't lots of time or methods within our four walls to have creative ideas. But you're going to have lots of creative ideas brushing your teeth in the morning, stuck in traffic, getting on the train, in the bar, and please remember them. They can be on any subject. Write them down. And once a week on 3:30 on Wednesday, we're going to bring them all. And they don't have to be on any subject that I, as boss, am predetermining. That's the whole point of creative ideas, is they're sometimes off-center. And then, but we don't want to lose them. And then let's talk about them there.
Well, I used to teach time management to the business school students, to the MBAs. I stopped teaching it when I realized I couldn't follow the incredibly good advice I was giving them. And that's an interesting phenomenon in and of itself, which we'll leave for another time. But one of the standard teachings of time management and prioritization and just productivity is that you should start your day, you should clean off your desk or clean your mind off and make sure when you should start it, you should make a to-do list for the day and have in mind not just answering the latest email, that's the urgent, but the important. You should make sure that you keep your big goals in mind, your big projects, etc. And it's probably better to do that than to just answer every phone call and every email that comes through and make sure that you're busy all day. But neither of those methods really creates that opportunity for creative thinking. And if you're right, and I think you are, that much of this creative thinking takes place at odd times when your brain is in a peculiar place, how might someone who wants to do more of that make that happen other than to, look around now and then or create those quiet moments? I'm not quite sure what the practical upshot of this is other than don't brainstorm at 3:30.
Well, don't brainstorm at 3:30. Do reverse brainstorming. Make sure you keep time for people to bring ideas that come out of nowhere, right? Mm-hmm. You have to carve that out. So
yep.
that, right? Encourage people to drop into each other's. When you have a thought, why wait? The other thing is say, and don't wait till Wednesday. If you think it's really interesting, go talk to somebody and drop in their office and say, look, I had a thought. Sometimes people say, oh, well, that kind of brainstorming is good. And it is. Someone dropping into their office saying, I had this thought. And you sitting there try to find time to say, okay, I have 2 minutes, let's talk. That's very good, right? That's a great kind of brainstorming because it's based on someone bringing an idea that they had, in that quiet moment of their mind. Now, the other thing is I think the most important thing is to tell people this because people waste an awful lot of time in other methods of trying to come up with the creative ideas. There's the creative stimulation thing where, let's play darts, let's have beanbag chairs, let's throw food up on the wall to see what patterns it makes. There's a whole
funny
industry.
Hats. Yeah.
There's a whole industry of this.
Yeah.
And again, it's based on the left-right brain. Let's turn off our analytical brain. Let's turn on our... the other thing is that you simply say to people, look, just what you said about trying to recover that name, just stop. Especially if you're working on something that has needs lots of creative ideas, have the courage to send people home early because the typical thing is to work on into the evening. And the research is very, very clear that, going home at 6, you do much better the next day than if you go home at midnight. And especially for creative ideas, the best thing to do is to work really hard, put everything on the shelves of your mind on what the problem is, what other people say, what the data is, what this is that, and then stop. Relax. Go bowling. Go to sleep, and you'll have far better ideas the following morning than if you had worked till midnight.
It reminds me of an interesting, weird subliterature that I think is unappreciated in the business world, which is how to write. If you read books on how to write, which I do from time to time, a lot of them have a strange section where the author is usually a successful writer who often has nothing useful to tell you because you're not that person. Stephen King wrote a really interesting book on writing, and there are many useful things in it, but there are many things that are only useful to Stephen King.
Right.
Write 2,500 words a day, or 5,000 or 10,000, whatever number he writes, is nice for Stephen, not so useful for most of us.
Right.
He says, never outline. I don't outline. Why? Well, it doesn't work for him, but for some people need to outline.
Right.
But one of the things that's in most of these books is how these writers jumpstart their, quote, creative juices. And what strikes me about that weird subliterature is how disparate those techniques are on the surface, but how they do have something in common, which you're talking about, which is to wipe the slate clean.
Right.
There's some people who go out and stand on a street corner and watch traffic for 20 or 30 minutes before they write and don't do anything. They don't think about anything. They don't do anything. Other people play loud rock music. Other people, gaze out a particular window at a particular setting, et cetera.
Right.
And I think that's the same process that's going on.
My own view is this is the hardest step because people are busy. Think of how easy it is to multitask now, which is the worst possible thing you can do to have a creative thought. I mean, there's so many ways you can do things. To actually free your mind is by far, I think, the hardest step.
Well, if you multitask enough, it's like doing nothing. It's like standing in a busy traffic corner because it's just all noise. You respond to emails, you're not even reading what you're writing.
Yeah, that's true. If you're really not thinking about any of it, that's true.
The other thought I had, going back to the reference I made to parenting, is I don't let our kids watch much television,
Uh-huh.
and they don't do much work on the computer in terms of games or exploration.
Right.
And I think I've always thought it's a good thing. I feel even better about it now because that stuff that goes on the shelves of the brain is what's important. And you want to vary it. You want to you want to expose your kids and yourself, certainly as a thinking adult, to as wide a variety of stuff that you can then link together to create creative stuff.
My own view would be, my understanding is through serial immersion, meaning you really immerse yourself into it, right? Whereas very often, the video and all this other stuff is very superficial.
Yeah, you're not paying attention to anything.
You're really not paying attention to anything. So, I mean, I'm the same way with my daughter.
Well, we'll see how
very
they turn.
Very little TV, very little.
Yeah, we'll see how these kids turn out. I think phenomenally, don't you? Let's move on to military issues.
Oh, okay. So, part of the beauty of this,
of course. That first segue? Yeah.
Part of the beauty of this is that really the whole idea here is that creativity is a combination. The combination is new, but the elements came before.
Yeah, I like that.
It's the only way it can happen.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
So it turns out there's nothing. So wonderfully, this confirms something that somebody wrote about in early military strategy, right? So once again, there's nothing new under the sun, but now we're able to appreciate it in modern terms. And it turns out the word strategy entered the English language in 1810. This is very late for an ordinary English word. Most ordinary English words are 13th century, 14th century, 15th century. And it's also very specific. It's not, early 19th century, it's 1810. And when I discovered this, I found it interesting. I had no idea why, and I looked it up and discovered that it was the height of success of Napoleon Bonaparte as a general. As an American, I didn't know that Napoleon was Napoleon because he won battle after battle across Europe personally, and that's how he became Napoleon, the Emperor of Europe. Europeans tend to know this very well because he conquered their country. So it turns out his enemies started studying how he did it, especially the Germans and the English, and so started the formal scholarship of strategy as an academic discipline in order to figure out how to defeat Napoleon. Certainly, strategy existed previously, if not in English, in other parts of the world, especially China, of course, where you get Sun Tzu, The Art of War. So strategy as a philosophy is ancient, but as a formal academic subject that we would recognize today as true scholarship, it dates from that period. And indeed, it's from that period that I'm describing, that we in business inherited formal strategy. Well, as it turns out, a Prussian named Karl von Clausewitz in 1832 published his answer to how Napoleon succeeded. And the book is called On War. It's still in print, a great classic taught in military academies around the world to this day. And right there, his most important idea is something he calls coup d'oeil, which is strike of the eye or a glance. And his description of it is amazingly similar to modern neuroscience of intelligent memory applied to new situations. That it's a new combination of previous elements. That Napoleon though he was very young and had never fought battles before, when he started out, he had mastered all the previous military moves and battles that came before him and was able to draw upon them in new combinations to win.
So he didn't. The point here is that he didn't, invent the V2 rocket or a nuclear bomb. He combined insights from previous campaigns, right, and
he would literally say. So his first Italian campaign, he'd say, "Well, this sort of looks like what Frederick the Great faced in his Silesian campaign of 1852." And indeed, you would, if you looked at Frederick's campaign, if you looked at this, you'd say, "Yes, I see why he says that." The Prussians are here, the Austrians are there, and he has the similar size forces, and so he's going to do the same thing to a degree, right? And then he combines something that Caesar did in a particular situation.
So your claim is that his creativity on the battlefield was partly a result of the stuff he had on the shelves, the fact that he had so many strategic campaigns from the past
Right.
In his hard drive, and then also presumably in his ability to see connections between them.
Yes, to literally keep his mind open.
Now, it sounds nice. It's hard to know if that's true. Let me give you a different example and get your reaction to it. When I read about the campaigns of the Confederate Army, another tactical genius, strategic genius, Robert E. Lee, what I notice is a different skill of leadership, which is not unrelated to what we're talking about, but it's slightly different, which is that he delegated a lot of authority to his underlings because he realized, I think, that they had information he could not pull into one place. And this is an idea of Friedrich Hayek we've talked about a number of times in past podcasts. This decision maker, the leader, whatever you want to call it, the CEO, can't have all the information that's available in the organization. And a huge part of leadership is finding ways to liberate that information to serve its best purpose. The price system does that in a modern economy. In an organization, you don't have prices, so you have to find some other way to liberate that. And in the case of Lee, he delegated a lot of authority to his generals and gave them lots of freedom to innovate in their corner of the battlefield, rather than getting a full report, figuring out this master plan, sending the information back down. So how does that relate to your understanding of what Napoleon was successful at?
Well, first of all, Lee himself was not a great battlefield general. So he wisely had other battlefield generals lead the battlefield strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good idea. It was the same thing with Eisenhower and Patton. Mm-hmm. Eisenhower was not a great battlefield general, but he did his best to give Patton, who would often act like a crazy man, but was a spectacular battlefield general, he did his best to give Patton, to delegate to Patton. Mm-hmm. Now, when he delegated to the other 10 generals of the Western Front in World War II, the results were not very good because they didn't do what Patton did. But to get back to the Confederate situation, in general, certainly delegation is good because then that person within their purview has the maximum flexibility and unity of command to do what they need to do. So that's really wonderful, and that's very important in a particular battle to do that. But still, Lee did not delegate overall strategy. So, for example, the invasion of the North, which was really his biggest strategic move. I mean, basically, here's what happened. To start the war, the North invaded the South, and the South, in a series of defensive battles, won. Right? Now, certainly in those series of defensive battles, the general in charge had full capacity of where and when to fight, and that's great. But when it came time to invade them, but then Lee said, look, we're going to lose eventually because the North is gearing up, with more.
Too much industrial capacity.
And industrial, right. So we said, let's invade. Now, he certainly did not delegate that.
Correct. No, right. And that's, you're really making a distinction here between tactics and strategy.
Well, or levels of strategy. In other words, like, if it's clear that, we're going to fight 7 battles in 7 different places, those 7 generals should be in charge. But if we're all together going to do something, I think I hope CEOs know that they have to decide.
Right. No, they don't understand. You don't send your 7 different pieces of your army off in different places. There has to be some unity.
Now, of course, that person, you should always keep an open mind. You should talk to as many people as possible. You shouldn't sit in your office and decide by yourself. Absolutely. But I think, one of the keys of strategy is that at some point somebody has to have a strategic idea on what to do. And all I'm doing is explaining where those good strategic ideas come from.
But the part about Napoleon that I found interesting, which reminded me of Lee, was the understanding that you didn't have to fight at this particular place, that where you fought was a valuable, it wasn't like checkers or chess where you raid yourself in battle against the other side. They understood that there were enormous advantages to just moving.
Yeah, and the Civil War is actually very interesting because it was only Grant. Lincoln was correct to keep firing his generals, and eventually it was Grant who figured this out. And really, the final success was Grant and Sherman. They both understood this, understanding the how mobile war works, and so that's why the North won.
So what does that have to do with with us today, this understanding of Clausewitz. What do we learn from Clausewitz and the lessons of military genius such as Napoleon?
Well, one thing that I found very, very interesting is because here we have this strategic, in a sense, sort of the classic of military strategy, is this very, as you say, sometimes you don't fight, and you conform your actions to the force of circumstance as you find it. And I think this is the opposite of, I think, what lots of people, including myself, have, and what I used to have, of the idea of how military strategy works, which is you set an ambitious goal and, an objective that you want to take, and then you mobilize all your troops and march them there to fight your way to that goal.
You have a plan for how it's going to unfold.
Right. And that your goal simply comes out from, you study the map and what's the objective you need to achieve. Versus, part of mobile war, which Lee came very close to winning, actually, and Grant eventually learned, is that your goal evolves. You only set your goal when you see a way to achieve it in some way. And this seems the opposite of hard-nosed military strategy, but it's actually military success.
And the same for business. I really like the insight that you don't plan that you're going to take over this industry and get there via this set of actions. You're looking for opportunity to exploit rather than
right.
Than
so,
formally.
If you see a way to do that, that's great.
Right,
now
yeah.
you know where to go, but you don't set that goal beforehand. That's madness.
Now, the question is this: how is there a way to do this with any degree of systematic attack? And let me say it a different way, a little more skeptical way. Is there anything that great innovators do that those of us who are not great innovators can get close to? Or is it merely the fact that their flashes of insight while they're brushing their teeth are always going to be better than mine, and so there's just nothing to be done about it?
Well, I think they learned it. They certainly weren't born with it. I think over time they learned that that's how you do it. Now, they may not have learned it consciously, but we can all learn it. Now, I just read a wonderful article about dyslexia, that 1/3 of successful entrepreneurs are dyslexic. So that's quite nice in that, it's some other way of thinking. In other words, don't just stick to the straight line. That's not what's going to get you there. Dyslexics are famous for seeing the whole, not just the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
So though in big companies,
but that's not very helpful for those of us who aren't dyslexic.
Well, wait a second. In smaller companies, in a longer conversation, I'll explain to you how it is helpful, but it would take too long to explain right now.
All right.
But in smaller companies, you can see right away it's easier. You have more control over how people spend their time. In big companies with these huge processes already in place, there's something I discovered at General Electric, which is a wonderful team exercise that basically can and should replace formal strategic planning for how to do this, for how a team can basically set a general idea of what the situation is and then lay out where they're going to steal from on what topics to see if they can put together a puzzle of a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a wonderful technique that mimics amazingly well intelligent memory applied to a team situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in the book, but I got it from General Electric.
Well, what I like that's really interesting about this this idea is that I think there's an enormous amount of imitation, which is a form of stealing, in business and in entrepreneurship, where people look at what works and they figure, I'll do that works. And one of the lessons of your book, I think, is that doing more of what works often isn't what gets you to the top. It's doing something different. And to think about ways of doing something that haven't been done before is much more productive than simply figuring out who's doing it well and we'll just do it better, which is always the safe approach. It's
there's a wonderful quote by T.S. Eliot, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948, American-British poet, and he said, it's a great quote, and he chose his words very carefully, of course, because he's a poet.
Yeah.
He said, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal." So this is really
good. I like that.
Quite great, because it's, if you're going to imitate somebody, you're going to do what they do, and you're probably going to be 2 steps behind them because they're ahead of you in doing it. Stealing means you're not going to be like them. You're going to take certain pieces of what they're doing and certain pieces of what somebody else is doing legally. I mean, legal stealing. You take that and that and that, and you make a new combination. Versus, I'm going to imitate what someone else is doing. This is an enormous. These are 2 very, very different things, and the difference is huge. So, Steve Jobs, the famous example, is where he and Wozniak had made a nice small machine, the Apple II, but it had a green screen. He got a chance to go to Xerox PARC and see what they had, and that's where he discovered the graphical user interface. And he had a very famous flash of insight where Wozniak's machine came into his mind combined with the graphical user interface that Xerox had showed him. And he didn't want to imitate Xerox because the machine that the GUI, the graphical user interface, was on that Xerox showed him was $16,000 and as big as a refrigerator. So if Jobs was going to imitate Xerox, he would make a machine as big as a refrigerator for $16,000.
With a prettier screen, maybe.
With a prettier screen. But no, he said, I just want that one thing. I want that graphical user interface. And it's wonderful, the interview that he describes this in. He says, and they showed me these 2 other things. I didn't even see those 2 other things. So he was very clear about he was selectively taking, right? And this is the key. You have to selectively take. And that's why it's a new combination, always.
Yeah, that particular insight, I think, of Jobs is underappreciated because so much of the wealth created that's measurable from that insight got captured by Bill Gates. But it was Jobs' insight and the beginning insights of the people at Xerox PARC that created the computer revolution and the Internet. Was the step that we needed before we could get all the rest of it. Without it, it would just be a hobby for a small group of people.
Right, and Jobs has continued to do this. The MP3 player was invented by Creative Technologies of Singapore. On and on and on. He's a master at seeing new combinations from what other people have already done.
Well, I want to talk about Schumpeter, and that maybe is a nice transition. Schumpeter and others talk about the difference between invention and innovation. The person who invented the GUI, the graphical user interface, or the MP3 player, that was an important step, but it wasn't the innovation. The innovation was Jobs bringing it into our houses in a way that couldn't have been done by the inventor.
Well, I mean, he's absolutely right. What's very interesting, though, of course, is that if you roll it backwards to the person who invented the GUI, you will indeed find that person, it's a new combination from previous elements.
Yeah, that's true.
So in a sense, even invention is amazingly more, has more stealing than most people think. But certainly Schumpeter is right, is that for the entrepreneur, that's not what do you care? I mean, all you care is how to make something happen. But typically entrepreneurs, and Schumpeter does say this, is that even the entrepreneur has to make a new combination. So the entrepreneur doesn't invent even business models, or at least not wholly. So, for example, you get another famous example where Ray Kroc was 52 years old, had invested his life savings in a machine that made milkshakes, 8 milkshakes at once.
Wow.
So you would probably say, he's driving around the country trying to sell these things, and you would probably say, here's a guy with zero strategic intuition, zero business acumen, the poor guy, would somebody just give him a job and end the misery of him trying to sell this stupid machine? Well, he finds out that one of his customers in San Bernardino, California, is using 8 of them at once. So he says, fabulous, let me go see what they're doing, and I'll tell all my customers how to use 8 at once. Well, lo and behold, he arrives, and it's a roadside restaurant called McDonald's, run by Mac and Dick McDonald's. And in Ray Kroc's book, his memoirs, he describes a classic flash of insight. He described it as an Idaho potato hitting him on the head, the way Newton's apple fell on his head. And he says, this is it. and it was an assembly line. He describes it. It was an assembly line of really the first fast food machine. And he said, I'm going to combine that with the franchise system of Howard Johnson's, which already had roadside franchises, 400 of them, but were sit-down restaurants. So he said, this is it. So these two things came together in his mind. So Ray Kroc invented the fast food franchise, but from two previous elements, the sit-down roadside franchise of Howard Johnson's and the exact fast food machine of the McDonald's brothers in San Bernardino, California.
The rest is history.
The rest is history.
Now,
and, there's a colleague here, he's actually 2 offices down from me, named Amar Bide. The best book for entrepreneurs to read is The Origin and Evolution of New Businesses. And he just documents how successful entrepreneurs actually succeeded. And certainly where they get their ideas is very much this kind of creative combination.
Now, of course, there's a selectivity bias here in that we know the ones that were great and that made it, became McDonald's, became the iPhone, et cetera. There must be thousands of combinatorial ideas that the people who thought of them thought were the greatest things since sliced bread, and they just turned out to be wrong.
Right. Absolutely. No question about it.
So I guess the lesson is that more ideas are better than fewer. And
well, also, what else are you going to do? It's no guarantee of success. That's for sure. There's no question about that. But I think it increases your chances of success.
Give us another example of a great innovator of our time who combined disparate elements, because I think those are very illuminating.
Well, I think I could tell you the Google story, but that actually would take quite a long time because it's a bit technical. But there's no question that they combined existing elements to make Google. One of the cases I like for a very important reason is, I'll tell you the reason after I tell you the case, is how Henry Ford came up with the moving assembly line. So it turns out the first stationary assembly line, meaning the chassis are lined up and the teams move along the chassis, was Oldsmobile 1901. And Oldsmobile had the first successful mass-produced car in the world, the Oldsmobile Runabout. Very cheap, very, very profitable. Oldsmobile's investors hated these cheap cars. They liked the really fancy handmade ones, or, artisan-made ones. And they stopped funding him. Olds left the business. Henry Ford imitated Olds exactly in stationary assembly line for Henry Ford's first cheap cars. But other car makers started coming in, and we asked the question, okay, Henry, how did you get the idea not to have the chassis stationary, but the chassis to move along a moving line? And this is in his memoirs. He got it from the Chicago stockyards. The moving overhead rail of the carcasses.
Yeah.
And this is really a wonderful example because it shows you how widely you have to open your mind for elements to combine.
Right, because the two have nothing to do with each other.
Nothing to do. Right, it has nothing to do with. He certainly needs to know car manufacturing pretty well to even understand what his problems are. But then he has to open his mind as widely as possible. And this is a mistake lots of people make in so-called best practice. They say, well, let's benchmark the best practice of our industry. Well, the answer is probably in some other industry.
So why do you like that example?
Exactly, because you have to look for creative ideas far outside your own industry.
How far away it is, yeah.
As far, you have no idea where they're going to come from.
Any lessons from these insights for personal life? I think a lot of people are always looking for a magic solution to either their future. I have a lot of listeners who tell me that they're looking for something new to do. They didn't get any formal education. Now they've suddenly gotten interested in ideas and they want to change careers. They don't know where to start. Other problems we might have would be, again, how to parent or simply how to move up the ladder of a particular career we have chosen. Any thoughts on what we can do?
Those are
not big enough for you? Okay.
Well, what it is they're different.
Yeah.
They're simply different.
That's all right. Go ahead.
But I guess I've thought a lot about this and encountered this a lot. The problem is that very often when people then go consult books that try to tell them what to do, it's all a version of personal strategic planning. It's all, what's your desire? What do you most want to do? And now set a plan to reach it.
And all you have to do is believe in it strongly enough.
Believe in yourself.
If you just work hard enough, you can make anything happen.
You can make anything happen, right? I mean,
this is silly.
This is complete madness, of course. But the lessons are all the same, really. So what would I say? Where would I start? I would start saying that it's not true that you can achieve anything you want to if you believe in yourself, set clear goals, and work hard. We should rather prepare for opportunity and try to stay open to it. Now, I have some very specific techniques for how people. I mean, let me just start with how people change careers or they want to do something different. They need an idea, right? You can't just say, well, I'd like to do something else. You need an idea for what you want to do. And even if you say, well, I would really like to be a concert pianist, you have to say, okay, well, what does it take to be a concert pianist? How many years are you going to work at it? And, if you're not going to put in that amount of time, you're probably not going to be a concert pianist. So that's fine. Don't worry about it. What else might you like to do?
Yeah.
So it's okay to start with what you might like to do because, there's really no other place to start. But what it is there's many things that probably could satisfy you, could make you happy. Many, many. You just have to discover them. And the discovery, there's a technique for how to discover that I call pure networking, where basically you just start with a puzzle or a question that interests you. And you can do this from your existing job very easily. So what you say is, well, what's an example? I would be interested in the XYZ business. Maybe. So you say, okay, all you need is one person to find one person who knows something about that business. And then you just have to ask an interesting question, an interesting puzzle about that business. So, for example, I'm terrible at coming up with these examples off the top of my head, but it could be, I'm interested in some kind of nutrition business, and I'm wondering if, it exists in Mexico, because I love Mexico. So you say, okay, find somebody who knows anything about the nutrition business in Mexico and ask them how the nutrition business in Mexico works. And then after you finish talking to that person, you say, that was really great. I learned a lot. Is there anybody else you think I could talk to?
Yeah, who else knows about this? Who else?
You say,
what can I read?
Give you. Well, the reading is less important than give me 3 more names.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Right? And those 3, you do exactly the same thing. 3 becomes 9, becomes 27. Eventually, or very quickly, you know more about the nutrition business in Mexico than some of the people you're talking to. And yes, you also read, because you do get interested, or you discover that you're actually not interested in the nutrition business in Mexico. But eventually, someone will say to you, "You seem to know quite a lot about this. Like, what are you doing? Are you interested in working in this?" And then you say, "Well, I might be." In other words, you achieve your goal by giving up your goal. You're not looking for a job. If you said to somebody, the first person, you said, "Hi, do you know if there's a business a job in the nutrition business in Mexico?" What would their answer be?
Of course not.
Of course not. End of conversation. Now, this for me is the biggest thing, because the leading bestseller for years in career switching. What would you say it is? Do you know which one it is?
I think it's Who Moved My Cheese, but I've never read it.
Oh, actually, that's true, right? That's short. That just tells you should change careers. The guide for how to change careers is What Color Is My Parachute?
What colors? Yeah.
Yeah. And when you boil it down, I looked. I said, so how does this person tell you exactly to get a new job? And I looked, and here's what the person said. I don't even know the author's name, but they said, find the one company in the world you'd most like to work for. Find the one division in that company you'd most like to work for. Find the one person who hires in that division. Go to that person and ask them for a job.
Kind of a long shot.
This is the worst possible advice I can possibly think of.
Yeah.
To think that the whole world is set up so that at the moment that you most want something, that thing you most want is there for you. I don't know where this idea came from.
Well, I see that in my students sometimes when they have a dream of going to law school, or going to a particular school for graduate school, or high school students I talk to, which I talk to from time to time, and their dream is to go to a particular university. And if they don't get into that university, they're devastated and they're crushed. And
they failed. They feel they failed.
And there are millions of people walking around the earth today, leading totally satisfied lives, who've never graduated from that school. It turns out, or who didn't end up majoring successfully in economics or whatever is your particular dream. And that is the risk of the, craft your dream, find the steps you need to get from A to Z, and then just execute.
Right.
Because sometimes it doesn't work out. And why?
Yeah. And when you look at great achievements, you find out that isn't how people did it. It's actually, I do know the source of it. There was a competitor to von Clausewitz in the military tradition at the same time, someone named Jomini, who actually laid out this set your goal and march your troops to achieve the goal. And he was very popular, but I think very wrong. So that's why I contrast the what color's my parachute, choose the company you want, choose the job you want, and go for it, versus this pure networking discovery of work your way through the field, person to person, discovering opportunity.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you about, again, I think what would be a parody of what you're saying, and make sure that this isn't what you're saying. I think a lot of people go through life, I forget where I first heard this imagery, but to me it's very powerful, as a cork. And they bob on the ocean. The current takes them here, it takes them there. They're purposeless, and they just kind of end up doing something that they didn't plan on it, and they just find themselves having spent their life doing this particular thing that they didn't love, and they have a lot of regret. And I think the counterpoint to the cork is this Jomini strategic vision, which we're both critiquing, which is, don't be a cork. Don't just be swept along by ocean tides. Take charge of your life. Have a goal and go for it.
Right.
And you're really talking about something much subtler that's, I think, something in between.
How about a canoe?
A canoe. Go ahead. We'll try to put into words, summarize what we've been talking about for how to get to where you might want to end up going.
I like the cork because if the alternative is no, decide you want to cross the ocean and just go across it. Well, how? Whereas a canoe is subject to the ebb and tide of the currents and the elements, but you have a paddle, and if you figure out how to do it, you can go lots of places.